The hands moved like water over stone, and Franklin Tucker couldn't look away even though he'd ridden 20 miles through desert heat, and his canteen had been empty for the last 5. Animas Forks, Colorado sat at nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, and the August sun of 1885 beat down without mercy on the mining town that clung to the mountainside like a stubborn prayer. Franklin had come seeking work in the silver mines, but instead found himself transfixed by the woman sitting outside the weathered building that served as both general store and post office. Her hands were covered in wet clay, spinning a wheel with her foot while she coaxed something beautiful from the shapeless mass before her. Dark hair escaped from beneath her bonnet, and her face held a concentration so pure it seemed almost sacred. "You planning to stand there gawking all day? Or you going to water your horse?" The woman spoke without looking up, her voice carrying the soft cadence of someone educated beyond what this rough town might suggest. Franklin felt heat rush to his face that had nothing to do with the Colorado sun. "I apologize, miss. I've never seen anyone work clay quite like that. Most folks up here are too busy digging silver out of the ground to appreciate what can be made from the earth itself." She finally looked up, and Franklin found himself staring into eyes the color of pine forests. "There's a trough around back. Your mare looks about done in." He nodded, leading his horse away, but his thoughts remained fixed on the woman and her spinning wheel. By the time he'd tended to his mare and made his way back around front, she was lifting a completed vase from the wheel, its form elegant despite the rough surroundings. She set it carefully on a wooden board beside 3 others, each one unique in shape and design. "Bethany Pearson," she said, wiping her hands on a stained apron. "I work the clay, and you look like a man who works cattle. Franklin Tucker. And you're right about the cattle, though I'm hoping to find work in the mines. Ranching hasn't been kind the past few years." Bethany stood, and he realized she was taller than most women he'd known, perhaps 5'8" to his own 6'1". "The mines will kill you slower than a bullet, but just as sure. Silver dust gets in your lungs and never comes out." She gestured to her pottery. "This is what I do instead of watching men cough themselves to death underground." The directness of her words should have put him off, but Franklin found himself intrigued. "You sell much pottery in a mining town?" "More than you'd think. Even rough men want something beautiful to look at when they're far from home. I make cups, plates, vases. Last month I made a chess set for the saloon owner. Men need reminders that life is more than digging and dying." Franklin glanced around the street of Animas Forks, taking in the ramshackle buildings that housed maybe 150 souls on any given day. The town was already well past its prime, having boomed in the 70s and now slowly declining as the easier silver played out. "Where'd you learn pottery?" "My father was a potter in Pennsylvania. Taught me everything before he died of consumption. My mother passed 2 years later, and I had a choice between marrying a man I didn't love or heading west with my wheel and my kiln." She smiled then, transforming her serious face into something luminous. "I chose the clay. Takes courage to come out here alone. Takes desperation." Bethany began gathering her finished pieces. "But I don't regret it, Mrs. Henderson lets me rent the back room of her store, and I built my kiln out of river stones. The clay I dig myself from a deposit about 2 miles up the mountain. It's good clay, fires well, holds shape." Franklin found himself wanting to know everything about her. "How long have you been here?" 3 years this September. Long enough to know everyone's business and to have them know mine, which isn't much to tell." She balanced the board carefully. "You hungry? Mrs. Henderson makes a decent stew, and you look like you haven't eaten properly in days." His stomach answered before he could, growling audibly. Bethany laughed, a sound that seemed to scatter the afternoon shadows. "Come on, then. Consider it a welcome to Anima's Forks, though I should warn you there's not much here to make you stay." The interior of Henderson's general store was dim and cool, packed floor to ceiling with supplies that served the dwindling mining population. Mrs. Henderson herself was a widow of perhaps 50 years, her face weathered but kind. She ladled stew into bowls without being asked, sizing up Franklin with the shrewd eye of someone who'd seen countless men pass through these mountains. "New arrival?" she asked. "Franklin Tucker, madam. Looking for work?" "Mines are hiring, but Miss Pearson's already told you what I think of that." Mrs. Henderson set cornbread beside the stew. "You any good with carpentry? The church roof is about to cave in, and Reverend Matthews has been looking for someone with skill." Franklin hesitated. He could work wood well enough, but it wouldn't pay like mining. Then again, he'd still have his lungs at the end of each day. "I could take a look at it." Bethany ate her stew quietly, but he caught her glancing at him between bites. There was an intelligence in her gaze that suggested she was measuring him, trying to determine what kind of man he was. Franklin had the distinct impression that, passing whatever test she was administering, mattered more than anything else that might happen in this fading mountain town. "You got a place to stay?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Not yet, madam. There's a boarding house run by Thomas Wright. He'll charge you fair. 2 buildings down on the left." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and when Bethany stood to return to her pottery, Franklin found himself following her back outside. The sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged peaks that surrounded Anima's Forks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity. "I meant what I said about the church roof," Franklin offered. "I'd like to help with that." Bethany set her pottery board down and turned to face him fully. "Why? You don't know anyone here. You could be down in the mines earning real money tomorrow." "Maybe I'm tired of just earning money. Maybe I want to do something that matters." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her, but they were true. He'd been drifting since his father's ranch went under, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough to put down roots. Something about this place, about her, made him want to stop moving. "The church is up the hill. White building, can't miss it. Reverend Matthews is usually there in the mornings." Bethany picked up a fresh ball of clay and returned to her wheel. "Fair warning, though, Franklin Tucker, this town gets in your bones. You might come for the work, but stay for reasons you can't quite explain." "And is that what happened to you?" Her hand stilled on the clay for just a moment. "I came for freedom and stayed because I found peace." The mountains don't judge, and the clay doesn't care about anything except how you shape it. There's something honest in that. Franklin nodded slowly, understanding more than she perhaps meant to reveal. He touched the brim of his hat. "Thank you for the meal recommendation, Miss Pearson. I expect I'll be seeing you around. It's a small town, Mr. Tucker. You can't really avoid anyone even if you tried." He smiled at that and headed toward the boarding house, very aware that she watched him go. The weight of her gaze felt like a promise of something he couldn't yet name. Thomas Wright's boarding house was clean if sparse, and Franklin paid for a week in advance. His room held a bed, a chair, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. From his vantage point on the second floor, he could see Bethany still working at her wheel, her form silhouetted against the dying light. She worked with absolute focus, and he wondered what it would be like to have something you loved so completely that the whole world fell away when you practiced it. That night, Franklin lay in his narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Anima's Forks settling into darkness. Men's voices carried from the saloon down the street, accompanied by the occasional burst of piano music. The wind whistled through the mountain passes, with a lonesome sound that seemed to echo in his chest. He thought about Bethany's hands on the clay, the way she'd coaxed beauty from formless earth, and found himself wondering what else those hands might shape given the chance. Morning came cold and bright, as it always did at high altitude. Franklin washed, dressed, and made his way to the church before breakfast. Reverend Matthews turned out to be a lean man of perhaps 60, with white hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades listening to confessions and offering comfort. "Mrs. Henderson said you might come by," the Reverend said, shaking Franklin's hand. "The roof's been troubling me all summer. We've got buckets positioned for when it rains, but that's no way to worship." Franklin climbed up to inspect the damage, finding it worse than he'd expected. Several support beams had rotted through, and the shingles were in poor condition. "This is going to take a few weeks to fix properly. I'll need materials. We've got a fund for church repairs. Not much, but enough for wood and nails. Can you do it?" Looking down at the Reverend's hopeful face, Franklin found himself nodding. "I can do it. I'll start today if you can get the materials here by this afternoon. Consider it done. And Mr. Tucker, thank you. This church matters to folks here more than you might think." Franklin spent the morning planning the repairs and taking measurements. Around noon, he headed back down the hill and found himself gravitating toward Henderson's store. Bethany was at her wheel again, though this time she was working on something different, a set of small bowls with intricate patterns carved into the still wet clay. "How's the church?" she asked without looking up. "How did you know I'd been there? This is Anima's Forks." "I knew before you finished climbing the hill." Now she did look up, and there was amusement in her expression. "Besides, Mrs. Henderson bet me $2 you'd actually show up. I told her you seemed the type to keep your word." "And who won the bet?" "She did." "I'm a pessimist when it comes to strangers." Bethany set down her carving tool, "but I'm glad to be wrong." Franklin leaned against the hitching post, watching her work. "How long does it take, from clay to finished piece?" "Depends on what I'm making and how complex the design is." "These bowls will need to dry for a few days before the first firing. Then I glaze them and fire again. A week, maybe 2, for something like this." "That's patience. That's pottery," she smiled. "You can't rush clay. Try to dry it too fast and it cracks. Fire it too hot and it explodes. You have to work with its nature, not against it." Sounds like good advice for more than just pottery. Bethany's hands stilled again, and she regarded him with those pine-green eyes. "You're thoughtful for a cowboy. Is that a compliment?" "I haven't decided yet." But she was smiling when she said it. Over the following days, Franklin fell into a routine. Mornings were spent working on the church roof, carefully replacing rotted beams and laying new shingles. The work was satisfying in a way that punching cattle had never been. He was building something, creating rather than just maintaining. Afternoons he'd find himself drawn to where Bethany worked, and she seemed to expect him, always having an extra cup of water or coffee ready. They talked about everything. She told him about Pennsylvania and her father's pottery shop, how she'd spent her childhood covered in clay dust and loving every minute of it. He told her about his family's ranch in New Mexico Territory, how they'd lost everything to drought and debt, how his parents had moved back east to live with relatives while he'd chosen to keep moving west instead. "Why didn't you go with them?" Bethany asked one afternoon, her hands shaping a large vase with a narrow neck. "Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. I couldn't face the idea of living in a city, working in a factory or an office. The West is hard, but it's honest. You know where you stand. And where do you stand now?" Franklin considered the question carefully. "I'm starting to think I might be standing exactly where I need to be." She didn't respond to that, but color touched her cheeks, and her hands moved a bit faster on the clay. By the end of his second week in Anima's Forks, Franklin had made progress on both the church roof and his understanding of Bethany Pearson. She was 24 years old, 2 years younger than himself. She'd never been married and seemed determined to remain that way, though he sensed it was more about protecting her independence than any aversion to love. She was fiercely intelligent, well-read despite limited access to books, and possessed a dry humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh more than he had in years. What surprised him most was how much she'd come to matter in such a short time. He found himself thinking about her while he worked, wondering what she was making, whether she'd smile when he came by later. The feelings were new and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "You're smitten," Mrs. Henderson said one morning when he came in for supplies. "Don't bother denying it." "I've seen that look before." Franklin didn't deny it. "Is she interested in anyone else, Bethany?" "Lord, no. She's turned down every proposal that's come her way, and there have been more than a few. Most men can't handle a woman who knows her own mind." Mrs. Henderson studied him with sharp eyes. "Question is, can you? I'd like the chance to find out. Then you'd better court her properly. She won't respect anything less than genuine effort." Taking Mrs. Henderson's advice to heart, Franklin began to plan. That evening, after finishing his work on the church, he sought out Reverend Matthews. "I need to know where Miss Pearson gets her clay," Franklin said. The Reverend raised his eyebrows. "Planning to take up pottery, something like that. Will you tell me?" "Up the Eastern Trail, about 2 miles. There's a clearing with a stream running through it. The clay deposit is near the water. She goes up there every few days to dig." Reverend Matthews paused. "She goes alone, usually armed." "The trail's safe enough, but a woman traveling solo needs to be careful." The next morning, Franklin borrowed a pickaxe and 2 canvas sacks from the boarding house and headed up the Eastern Trail before dawn. The climb was steep, winding through pine forest and alpine meadow, but the beauty of it stole his breath. By the time he reached the clearing, the sun was fully up, and he could see why Bethany loved this place. The stream ran clear and cold, and the clay deposit was obvious, a reddish-brown bank exposed where the water had eroded the hillside. Franklin had never dug clay before, but he understood earth and how to work it. He spent 2 hours carefully extracting the best material he could find, filling both sacks until they were almost too heavy to carry. The journey back down was harder than the climb up, but he made it by early afternoon, depositing the clay beside Bethany's work area while she was inside having lunch. When she emerged and saw the sacks, she stopped short. "What's this, Clay? Figured you might be running low." Bethany walked over and opened one of the sacks, running her fingers through the material. "This is from my spot. You went all the way up there. Seemed like you could use help carrying supplies." She stood there for a long moment, just looking at him. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers still dusty with dry clay. "Thank you. That was kind." The touch of her hand sent electricity up his arm. Franklin wanted to pull her close, to tell her everything he was feeling, but something held him back. Patience, he reminded himself. Clay couldn't be rushed, and neither could whatever was growing between them. "It's nothing," he said, though they both knew it was more than that. "It's not nothing." Bethany squeezed his hand once before letting go. "Nobody's done something like that for me since I came here. Everyone's always so focused on silver and money. You brought me something that actually matters. I'm learning what matters by watching you work." She smiled then, that luminous smile that transformed her whole face. "You want to try it, the pottery, I mean. I could teach you the basics." Franklin had no particular interest in pottery, but he had tremendous interest in spending time with her. "I'd like that." They started that very afternoon. Bethany showed him how to wedge the clay, working out air bubbles that could cause explosions in the kiln. Then she positioned him at the wheel and stood behind him, guiding his hands. "Feel the clay," she said softly, her breath warm against his ear. "Don't fight it. Let it tell you what it wants to become." With her hands over his, Franklin tried to center the spinning clay. It was harder than it looked, requiring a delicate balance of pressure and release. The clay wobbled and threatened to fly off the wheel entirely. Bethany laughed, a sound of pure delight, and helped him bring it back under control. "You're trying to muscle it. Gentle pressure. Like this." She pressed his hands inward ever so slightly, and suddenly the clay began to rise, forming a rough cylinder. Franklin felt the magic of it, the transformation of formless earth into shape and structure. But more than that, he felt Bethany's presence, the warmth of her body close to his, the way they moved together as if they'd been doing this for years rather than minutes. "There," she said. "You're getting it." They worked together until the clay collapsed, but Franklin didn't care. The pottery didn't matter. This closeness, this sharing of something she loved, that was what mattered. Over the next few weeks, their relationship deepened in ways both obvious and subtle. Franklin finished the church roof to great celebration from the community. Reverend Matthews insisted on holding a special service to bless the new construction, and the whole town turned out. Franklin sat in the back pew, uncomfortable with the attention, until Bethany slid in beside him and took his hand. "You did a good thing," she whispered. "Let them thank you." After the service, there was a social gathering with food and music. Franklin found himself dancing with Bethany in the churchyard while someone played a fiddle. She fit perfectly in his arms, and when she looked up at him, he saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. "I wasn't expecting you," she said quietly as they swayed to the music. "Expecting me? When you first showed up, I thought you'd be like all the others. Here for quick money, then gone. But you're different. You see things. You care about things that matter." Franklin pulled her a little closer, propriety be damned. "I see you, Bethany. That's what I care about most." She caught her breath, and for a moment he thought she might pull away. Instead, she rested her head against his chest. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've built a life here, a good life. What if letting you in changes everything? Change isn't always bad. Sometimes it's exactly what we need." Spoken like a man who's never had much to lose. "I've lost plenty," Franklin said. "My family's land, my parents, my direction. But I'm tired of losing. I want to build something real, something that lasts. And I want to build it with you." Bethany lifted her head and looked at him with those pine-green eyes swimming in tears. "That's quite a declaration for a man who's been in town less than a month. Does time matter when you know?" "I don't know. I've never felt like this before." "Neither have I." Franklin cupped her face gently. "So maybe we figure it out together." Right there in the churchyard, with half the town watching, Franklin leaned down and kissed her. Bethany's arms came up around his neck, and she kissed him back with a passion that made his head spin. When they finally broke apart, someone whooped, and laughter rippled through the crowd. "Well," Bethany said, her face flushed, "I suppose the whole town knows our business now." "Is that a problem?" "Not even a little bit." They spent that evening walking through Anima's Forks, talking about their future for the first time. Bethany showed him the small house she rented at the edge of town, complete with the kiln she'd built herself. Franklin talked about his dreams of owning land again someday, maybe raising cattle and horses like his father had. "We could combine our skills," Bethany said thoughtfully. "You could work the land and I could sell pottery. Between the two, we might make a real living." "Are you proposing a business partnership or something more?" Franklin asked, his heart hammering. Bethany turned to face him in the moonlight. "I'm proposing we stop pretending this is anything less than what it is. I love you, Franklin Tucker." I probably have since you carried 2 sacks of clay down a mountain just to help me. The joy that flooded through him was almost painful in its intensity. I love you too, more than I knew it was possible to love someone. Then let's shape our future together, Bethany said, and Franklin heard the echo of her craft in those words. Shape their future like she shaped clay, with patience and care and vision. Marry me, he said. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Let me spend my life learning what makes you smile, helping carry your clay, watching you create beautiful things. Yes, Bethany laughed and kissed him again. Yes, absolutely yes. They decided to wait until spring for the wedding, wanting time to plan properly and to save money. Franklin took a permanent position as the town's carpenter and general repairman, finding more than enough work to keep him busy. The silver mines were playing out, but people still needed buildings maintained, furniture built, tools repaired. He was good with his hands and patient with difficult jobs, and word spread quickly that he was reliable. Bethany's pottery business thrived as well. Franklin built her a proper workshop with good light and storage for her materials. He also constructed display shelves for Henderson's store where she could showcase her work. Travelers passing through Anima's Forks began to take note of her unique pieces, and orders increased. She taught Franklin more about pottery in the evenings, and while he never developed her skill, he learned to appreciate the craft and occasionally managed to create something worthwhile. Winter came hard to the mountains that year. Snow piled 10 feet deep in places, and temperatures plunged well below zero. Anima's Forks became isolated, cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time. But rather than feeling trapped, Franklin felt freed. With less work available due to the weather, he spent most of his time with Bethany, helping her prepare inventory for the spring season. They grew closer in the quiet intimacy of those winter months. They learned each other's habits and quirks, argued occasionally about small things, and made up with laughter and kisses. Mrs. Henderson chaperoned when necessary, but everyone in town knew they were as good as married already. They were simply waiting for the mountain passes to clear so they could have a proper wedding. One particularly brutal night in January, a storm hit with unexpected fury. Franklin was caught at Bethany's workshop when the wind began howling and visibility dropped to nothing. Mrs. Henderson sent word that he should stay put rather than risk the short walk back to the boarding house. "I'll sleep in the workshop," Franklin said, not wanting to compromise Bethany's reputation. "Don't be ridiculous," Bethany replied. "You'll freeze out there." "The house has a fireplace and spare blankets. We're adults, Franklin. We can share space for one night without causing scandal." So Franklin stayed, and they sat by the fire talking until late into the night. Bethany showed him sketches she'd been making for new designs, including an elaborate chest set with pieces shaped like figures from mythology. Franklin told her about the ranch he dreamed of buying, somewhere with good water and grass, maybe down in the valley where winters weren't quite so harsh. "We could have both," Bethany said thoughtfully. "A ranch with enough land that I could build a real pottery studio. We could sell cattle and pottery both, maybe even take pieces to Denver once the railroad gets closer. You'd want to live on a ranch. It's isolated, hard work. I'm living at 12,000 feet in a mining town that's slowly dying. How much more isolated can it get?" She smiled at him across the firelight. "Besides, I'd be with you. That's all the company I need." Franklin crossed to where she sat and knelt beside her chair. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. I could never regret this. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." They fell asleep by the fire that night, wrapped in blankets, Bethany's head on Franklin's shoulder. It was innocent and chaste and absolutely perfect. When Franklin woke at dawn, he watched her sleep for a long moment, marveling at how much his life had changed since that August day when he'd ridden into town dying of thirst and found water of an entirely different kind. Spring finally came in April, painting the mountains in wildflowers and snowmelt. The passes cleared, and wagons could navigate the roads again. Franklin and Bethany set their wedding date for May 15th, giving people time to prepare and allowing traveling merchants to bring supplies for the celebration. The week before the wedding, Franklin received a telegram that shook him to his core. His father had died suddenly of a heart condition, and his mother was asking him to return east for the funeral. The timing couldn't have been worse, but there was no question of what he had to do. "I'll come with you," Bethany said immediately when he told her. "It's 2 weeks of travel each way, minimum. We'd have to postpone the wedding." "Then we postpone it. Franklin, your father died. You need to be with your family." They postponed the wedding and made arrangements to travel to Pennsylvania, where Franklin's parents had settled. Mrs. Henderson agreed to watch over Bethany's workshop and inventory. Thomas Wright promised to keep Franklin's tools secure. The whole town seemed to turn out to see them off on the stage that would take them to the nearest railroad. The journey was long and exhausting, but having Bethany beside him made it bearable. Franklin's mother was a small woman worn down by grief and hard years. She embraced her son fiercely, then turned to Bethany with curiosity. "So you're the woman who captured my son's heart. He wrote about you, said you were special." "He's the special one, Mrs. Tucker. I'm just a potter who got lucky." Franklin's mother smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "Come inside, both of you. We have much to discuss." The funeral was simple and dignified. Franklin's father was buried in a cemetery overlooking rolling green hills that couldn't have been more different from the stark mountains of Colorado. Afterward, Franklin's mother insisted they stay a few days. "Tell me about Anima's Forks," she said. "Tell me about this life you've built." They spent long evenings talking, and Franklin watched his mother's face transform as Bethany described the pottery she made and the community that had embraced her. His mother had been a vibrant woman once, before poverty and loss had ground her down. Talking to Bethany seemed to remind her of possibilities beyond mere survival. On their last evening, Franklin's mother took his hand. "Your father and I lost our way. We let debt and drought take everything, including our hope. But you haven't lost anything. You found something real." She glanced at Bethany. "Hold on to her. Hold on to what you're building. Don't make the mistakes we made." "I won't, Mother, I promise. And bring her back to visit when you can. I'd like to know my grandchildren someday." The journey back to Colorado felt different, infused with both sorrow and hope. Franklin grieved his father but felt grateful they'd had a chance to say goodbye, even if it had been through telegraph wires and distance. Bethany was a constant source of comfort and strength, and he fell in love with her all over again, watching how she cared for him through his grief. They arrived back in Anima's Forks in early June to find the town bedecked with flowers and banners. Mrs. Henderson had organized everything, determined that their wedding would be the social event of the season. The ceremony was reset for the following Saturday, giving them just enough time to settle in and prepare. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the kind of mountain day that made you believe in divine providence. Bethany wore a dress she'd commissioned from a seamstress in Denver, pale blue with embroidered flowers. Franklin wore his best suit, borrowed from Thomas Wright since his own clothes were still road-worn from travel. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony in the church Franklin had repaired, and it seemed fitting somehow, this building he'd restored with his hands becoming the place where he married the woman he loved. Bethany's vows were simple, but profound. I promise to shape our life together with the same care I give my pottery. To be patient, to work with your nature instead of against it, to create something beautiful and lasting from the raw material of two separate lives joined. Franklin's own vows came from his heart. I promise to carry your burdens when they're too heavy, to protect what we build together, to never stop seeing the magic in what you do and who you are. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them married, Franklin kissed his wife with all the pent-up emotion of months of waiting. The congregation erupted in cheers, and someone fired a gun into the air in celebration, because this was still the West after all. The reception lasted into the night, with music and dancing and more food than the small town could reasonably produce. Franklin danced with his bride until his feet ached, and even then he didn't want to stop. Bethany glowed with happiness, and everyone who saw them agreed they'd never witnessed two people more perfectly matched. They spent their wedding night in Bethany's house, which was now Franklin's house too. It felt surreal to finally have that intimacy they'd been waiting for, to truly become husband and wife in every sense. Bethany was nervous but eager, and Franklin was gentle, making sure her first time was everything she deserved. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window. I was so scared when you first showed up, Bethany admitted. Scared of what I was feeling, scared of losing my independence. Are you still scared? Terrified, but in a good way. Like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown but knowing you have to jump. She propped herself up on one elbow. Let's do it, Franklin. Let's find that ranch you've been dreaming about. Are you sure? You've built so much here. I've built skills and a reputation. Those travel with me, but I can't build a future in a dying town. Anima's Forks is fading. Another 5 years and there won't be enough people left to support what I do. She traced patterns on his chest. Let's go somewhere with space to grow. Somewhere we can raise a family and build something that lasts beyond the silver boom. They spent the summer preparing for their move. Franklin took on extra carpentry jobs to save money while Bethany sold off her inventory and carefully packed her wheel, tools, and supplies. They made inquiries about land for sale in the valleys to the south and west, looking for something with water access and good grazing. In August, exactly 1 year after Franklin had first ridden into Anima's Forks, they found their property. It was 160 acres in the wet mountain valley, with a creek running through it and views of the Sangre de Cristo Range that took their breath away. The previous owner had died, and his widow was selling cheap, eager to move back east. Franklin and Bethany bought it with their combined savings plus a small loan from Mrs. Henderson, who'd become like a mother to them both. The land came with a small cabin and barn, both in need of repair but structurally sound. Franklin spent September and October fixing the buildings while Bethany set up her pottery workshop in a corner of the barn. They bought 12 head of cattle and 4 horses, the beginning of their ranch herd. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, bought with their own labor and dreams. Their first winter on the ranch was hard but rewarding. They were isolated, snowed in for weeks at a time, but they'd prepared well with food and supplies. Bethany threw pots by lamplight while Franklin handled the livestock and kept the buildings maintained. They grew closer still, learning to work as a seamless team. In January, Bethany discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. The nearest doctor was a full day's ride away, and winters could make travel impossible. But Mrs. Henderson had experience with midwifery, and she promised to come stay with them when Bethany's time grew near. Spring brought renewal and hope. Bethany's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Franklin completed an addition to the cabin that would serve as a nursery. They planted a large garden and sold 3 steers for good money at market. Bethany's pottery was in high demand in the valley towns, and she could barely keep up with orders despite working every day. In late August, 2 years after Franklin had first laid eyes on her, Bethany went into labor. Mrs. Henderson coached her through it with Franklin holding her hand the entire time. The birth was long and difficult, but finally, in the early hours of the morning, their son was born, healthy and howling with outrage at the world. "Benjamin," Bethany said, cradling him close. "Benjamin Tucker." Franklin stared at his son in wonder. This tiny person was a product of their love, a physical manifestation of everything they'd built together. "He's perfect. He looks like you," Mrs. Henderson said with satisfaction. "Same stubborn chin." Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and magical. Franklin discovered reserves of patience he didn't know he possessed, walking the floor at night with Benjamin when Bethany needed rest. She returned to pottery slowly, working with the baby sleeping in a basket beside her wheel. They learned to function on little sleep, and even less time alone, but neither would have changed a single thing. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing new growth and challenges. They bought more cattle and built a proper pottery studio separate from the barn. Franklin's skill with carpentry became known throughout the valley, and he took commissions for furniture and buildings in addition to running the ranch. Bethany's art evolved, becoming more sophisticated and sought after. They sold pieces as far away as Denver and Santa Fe. Benjamin grew into a serious, thoughtful child who loved both cattle and clay. At 5 years old, he could ride a gentle horse and was learning to center clay on his mother's wheel. Franklin and Bethany decided they wanted more children, and when Benjamin was 6, they welcomed twin daughters into the world, Rachel and Sarah. The girls were as different as night and day, Rachel bold and adventurous, Sarah quiet and artistic. Life on the ranch was everything they dreamed and more. Franklin woke each morning beside the woman he loved and fell asleep each night grateful for another day together. They argued sometimes about money or child rearing or the best way to handle ranch business, but they always worked through it. The foundation they'd built in Anima's Forks had proven unshakable. One summer evening when Benjamin was 10 and the twins were 4, the family sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Benjamin was helping his father repair a bridle while Rachel and Sarah played with clay scraps from their mother's studio. Bethany sat in her rocking chair, pregnant again with their 4th child, due in the fall. "Tell us the story again," Rachel demanded. "About how you met." Franklin and Bethany exchanged glances. They'd told the story countless times, but it never got old. "Well," Franklin began, "I rode into a little mountain town dying of thirst, and I saw your mother making magic out of mud." "It's clay, not mud," Sarah corrected seriously, making her parents laugh. "Your father watched me work," Bethany continued. "And I thought he was just another drifter passing through. But he stayed. He fixed the church roof and carried my clay down the mountain and looked at me like I was something precious." "And then you fell in love," Rachel said with satisfaction. "Then we fell in love," Franklin agreed. "And we built this life together, brick by brick, day by day." "Like shaping clay," Benjamin said thoughtfully. He was old enough now to understand the metaphor. "Exactly like that," Bethany said. "Life is clay, and we shape it through our choices and our love and our willingness to work together." Franklin reached over and took his wife's hand. 15 years had passed since that August day in Anima's Forks, and she was more beautiful to him now than she'd been then. Time had added lines to her face and silver to her hair, but it had also deepened everything between them, creating bonds that could weather any storm. Their 4th child, another son they named William, was born in October. The birth was easier than the others, and Bethany recovered quickly. William was a cheerful baby who rarely cried and smiled constantly. Benjamin doted on his little brother while the twins competed for his attention. As the years continued to pass, Franklin and Bethany watched their children grow into remarkable people. Benjamin proved to have his father's way with animals and his mother's artistic eye, becoming an excellent rancher who also threw beautiful pottery. Rachel turned out to be a natural horsewoman and businesswoman, taking over much of the ranch's financial management by the time she was 16. Sarah was quieter but possessed her mother's deep talent for pottery, creating pieces that sold for impressive prices. William, the surprise baby, grew into a storyteller and musician, adding culture and joy to their remote ranch. The ranch itself prospered beyond their initial dreams. They now ran 200 head of cattle and bred horses that were sought after throughout Colorado. Bethany's pottery studio employed 2 apprentices, young women she was training in the craft. Franklin's carpentry skills had built not just their own buildings but structures throughout the valley, each one bearing his mark of quality and care. When Franklin turned 50 and Bethany 48, they took a trip back to Animas Forks, wanting to show their children where it all began. The town had changed dramatically. Most of the buildings were abandoned now, the silver completely played out. Only a handful of people remained, clinging to memories and stubbornness. Mrs. Henderson had passed away 5 years earlier, but her store still stood, empty and weathered. "It's sad," Rachel said, looking at the ghost town. "All these people's dreams just gone." "Not gone," Bethany corrected gently. "Changed. The silver was always going to run out. The people who stayed too long were chasing something temporary. But what your father and I found here, that was permanent." Franklin stood where he'd first seen Bethany working her wheel, and the memory was so vivid he could almost see her there, young and fierce and independent. "This place gave me everything that matters. It gave me your mother, and through her, all of you." They spent one night in Animas Forks, camping under the stars since the boarding house was long closed. Around the fire, Franklin told stories of the early days while Bethany added details he forgot. The children listened, fascinated by this glimpse into their parents' past. "Did you know right away?" Sarah asked. "That you'd get married?" Franklin considered the question carefully. "I knew something important was happening. I didn't have words for it yet, but I knew I couldn't leave." "I fought it harder," Bethany admitted. "I'd built walls around my heart, thinking independence meant being alone. Your father taught me that real strength is letting someone in, sharing the burdens and the joys." "That's beautiful, Ma," Benjamin said quietly. At 24, he'd recently married himself and was beginning to understand what his parents had built. The next morning they left Animas Forks for the last time. Franklin didn't feel sad exactly. The town had served its purpose, bringing 2 lost souls together and giving them a foundation. Everything after that they'd built themselves. More years flowed past. Benjamin and his wife gave Franklin and Bethany their first grandchildren, twin boys who inherited the family's stubbornness and charm. Rachel married a neighboring rancher, combining properties and creating one of the largest spreads in the valley. Sarah opened her own pottery studio in Colorado Springs, selling to wealthy tourists and earning regional fame. William traveled as a musician but always returned home, bringing stories and songs from far away. Franklin's hair turned completely white, and his hands showed the wear of decades of hard work, but he remained strong and vital. Bethany's hands developed arthritis, making pottery more difficult, but she adapted her techniques and continued creating. If anything, her later work was even more beautiful, informed by a lifetime of experience and love. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration that brought together friends and family from across Colorado. The ranch house expanded multiple times over the years, filled with laughter and music. Franklin and Bethany stood together watching the party, his arm around her shoulders. "You ever wish you'd done things differently?" Bethany asked. "Not once, not ever. I wish I'd been less scared at the beginning, but I don't regret a single day since I said yes to you." Franklin turned her to face him. Despite the gray hair and the lines, he still saw the woman from Anima's Forks, still felt the same leap in his chest when she smiled. "You took shapeless clay and turned it into art. You took a lost cowboy and gave him purpose. Everything good in my life flows from that August day when I was too thirsty and stubborn to keep riding. And you took a lonely woman and taught her that independence and partnership could coexist, that love doesn't diminish, it expands." Bethany reached up and touched his face. 30 years, and I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. That's because our love is like your pottery. It's been through fire and only emerged stronger for it." They danced that night like they had at their wedding, surrounded by the family and life they'd built together. When Franklin looked around at his children and grandchildren, at the ranch that had grown from dreams and hard work, he felt a satisfaction so profound it brought tears to his eyes. The years continued their steady march. Franklin and Bethany both lived into their 70s, remaining active and engaged with ranch life and pottery. They became the wise elders of the valley, sought out for advice and stories. Young couples came to ask them the secret to lasting love, and the answer was always the same. "Work together," Franklin would say. "Be patient," Bethany would add. "Love is like clay. You can't rush it, you can't force it, you have to work with its nature." "And never stop choosing each other," they'd say together. "Every single day choose love, choose partnership. Choose the future you want to shape together." On a crisp October morning, 45 years after they'd first met, Bethany passed away in her sleep, her hand in Franklin's just as it had been for nearly their entire marriage. The grief nearly broke him, but their children rallied around, reminding him that Bethany lived on in all of them, in their work, in their values, in the love they showed each other. Franklin lived another 2 years, spending his time finishing projects Bethany had started and telling stories to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He never stopped missing her, but he took comfort in knowing they'd built something that would outlast them both. The ranch continued. The pottery tradition passed down through Sarah's line. Most importantly, the love they'd shared rippled outward through generations. On a summer evening much like the one when he'd first ridden into Anima's Forks, Franklin passed away peacefully on the porch he'd built with his own hands, looking at mountains that had witnessed their entire love story. His last thought was of Bethany's hands on clay, shaping beauty from nothing, and how she'd done the same with his life. Their children buried them side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch, marked with a simple stone. But the real monument to their love was everywhere. In the buildings Franklin had constructed, in the pottery that bore Bethany's style and influence, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who inherited their passion and determination. The ranch house remained in the family for over a century, becoming a beloved gathering place for reunions and celebrations. In the main room, a special shelf held Bethany's finest pottery pieces, never to be sold, preserving her artistry for future generations. And in the workshop, now a museum of sorts, her original wheel still sat, ready to spin, a testament to the woman who'd shaped clay into art and a life into legend. Visitors to the old ranch, which eventually became a historical site, would hear the story of Franklin and Bethany Tucker, the cowboy and the potter who'd built an empire of love in the Colorado mountains. They'd see the pottery and the buildings and the photographs, but what they really saw was proof that love, real love, could transform everything. The story became a valley legend, told around campfires and dinner tables. How a thirsty cowboy had watched a potter shape clay and dared to ask her to shape their future together. How she'd said yes, and together they'd created something more beautiful and lasting than any single piece of art could ever be. Their great-great-grandchildren still told the story, keeping it alive, making sure no one forgot that love and patience and shared dreams could build foundations that lasted forever. That two people who chose each other, day after day, year after year, could create a legacy that transcended their own lives. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moved through the valley just right, people swore they could hear the sound of a pottery wheel spinning, accompanied by the distant laughter of two souls who'd found each other against all odds and built a love story worthy of the ages. The cowboy who'd stopped to watch, and the potter who'd invited him to stay. Together, they'd shaped a future more beautiful than anything they could have created alone, proving that the best art is the life we build with the ones we love.